April 30th, 1940, 4:47 a.m., northern Germany. Soviet tank commander Lieutenant Georgy Elisaev stood at the gates of what intelligence had called a work camp for women. He'd liberated concentration camps before, Majdanek, Auschwitz. He thought he'd seen the worst of what human beings could do to each other. He was wrong. Behind those gates were 3,500 women, not hundreds, not thousands. 3,500 women. Polish resistance fighters, French nuns, German communists, Russian nurses, Jewish mothers. The youngest was 14. The oldest was 72. They'd been starved, tortured, and worked to death. The Nazis called it Ravensbrück, the Bridge of Ravens. The women called it something else, hell. But here's what the history books don't tell you. When those Soviet tanks rolled through the gates, the women didn't cheer. They didn't cry. They didn't even move. Because after 3 years in hell, they'd learned not to trust anyone in a uniform, even liberators. This is the story of what happened next. The story of the most forgotten liberation of World War II, the story of 50,000 women the Nazis tried to erase from history, and the story of why 80 years later we're still learning what courage really looks like. Ravensbrück wasn't Auschwitz. It wasn't a death camp with gas chambers and crematoria working around the clock. It was something different, something the Nazis called a protective custody camp for antisocial women. That's Nazi speak for prison for women who refuse to obey. It opened in May 1939, 60 miles north of Berlin, on the shores of a lake so beautiful it looked like a postcard. Heinrich Himmler personally chose the location. He wanted it isolated, quiet, somewhere no one would ask questions about the screams. The first prisoners arrived in May 1939, 867 women from Lichtenberg concentration camp, German political prisoners, communists, Jehovah's Witnesses, women the Nazis called asocials, prostitutes, lesbians, homeless women, anyone who didn't fit the perfect Aryan housewife mold. But as the war spread, so did Ravensbrück's population. By 1942, trains arrived weekly. Polish resistance fighters captured during the Warsaw Uprising, French women caught hiding Allied pilots, Russian nurses captured on the Eastern Front, Jewish women from across occupied Europe, Roma women, women who'd been doctors, teachers, artists, mothers, women whose only crime was being born at the wrong time in the wrong place. By 945, Ravensbrück held over 50,000 women from 40 different countries. The camp was designed for 6,000. They packed 10 women into barracks meant for 100. They gave them 800 calories a day, half a bowl of watery soup, and a piece of moldy bread. They worked them 14 hours a day making German uniforms, building V-2 rocket parts, testing experimental drugs. And when the women got too weak to work, the camp had a solution: sub-camps. Secret facilities in the woods where useless prisoners disappeared. Nobody asked what happened there. Everyone knew. Germaine Tillion, a French anthropologist imprisoned at Ravensbrück, later wrote, Ravensbrück wasn't designed to kill quickly like Auschwitz. It was designed to kill slowly, to break you, to erase your humanity one day at a time until you forgot you'd ever been human. But the women refused to forget. Lieutenant Elisaev had liberated camps before, but nothing prepared him for this. He was a Soviet officer, 31 years old, from a small village outside Moscow. Before the war, he'd been a school teacher. Now he commanded 3 T-34 tanks and 30 infantrymen in the final push through Germany. He'd seen Majdanek in 1944. The gas chambers, the crematoriums, the mountains of shoes. He'd thought nothing could be worse. Ravensbrück proved him wrong, not because of the scale. Ravensbrück was smaller than Auschwitz, but because of what he saw in the women's eyes. At Auschwitz, the survivors had rushed toward the Soviet soldiers, embracing them, crying, thanking God for their liberation. At Ravensbrück, the women just stood there, silent, watching, waiting to see what these new men in uniforms would do to them. Block 10 was the medical experimentation block. SS doctors used Ravensbrück prisoners as test subjects for new drugs, surgical techniques, and sterilization procedures. They called it medical research. The women called it torture. 74 Polish women, later known as the rabbits because they were used like laboratory animals, were subjected to bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration experiments. SS doctors would deliberately infect their legs with bacteria, shatter their bones with the hammers, then attempt experimental treatments. Most of the women were left permanently disabled. Some died. But here's what the Nazis didn't expect. Those 74 women refused to die quietly. They smuggled out information about the experiments through secret notes hidden in laundry. They testified at Nuremberg after the war. They made sure the world knew what had happened. Block 11 was the punishment block. Women caught stealing food, helping others escape, or breaking camp rules were sent there. Punishment ranged from 25 lashes to solitary confinement in standing cells, boxes so small you couldn't sit or lie down. You stood in darkness for days, sometimes weeks. Odette Sansom, a British SOE agent captured in 1943, spent months in Block 11. She was interrogated 16 times, tortured repeatedly, and sentenced to death. But she never broke. After the war, she became the first woman awarded the George Cross. When asked how she survived, she said, "I never forgot who I was." The Siemens factory was where most women worked, 12-hour shifts, building electrical components for German weapons. The factory was brutal. Women stood at assembly lines until their feet bled. They breathed toxic fumes until their lungs failed. They worked until they collapsed. But they also sabotaged. Women deliberately slowed production. They assembled parts incorrectly so weapons would malfunction. They stole food, smuggled messages, and organized secret resistance cells. The Nazis never understood why Ravensbrück's production rates were 40% lower than other camps. The women knew. The children's block was where Ravensbrück became unbearable. Over 800 children were born in Ravensbrück between 1939 and most died within weeks. Starvation, disease, exposure. The SS gave newborns no food, no milk, no warmth. Mothers watched their babies die and were forced to keep working. But some women fought back. Camp doctors, prisoners themselves, secretly fed babies, hid them during inspections, and forged death certificates to save children marked for extermination. By war's end, 560 children had survived Ravensbrück. Every one of them owed their life to women who refused to let the Nazis win. January 1940, the Soviet Red Army crossed into Germany. The Nazis knew the end was near, and they panicked. Heinrich Himmler issued a direct order, "No prisoner shall fall alive into enemy hands." That meant one thing, liquidation. At Auschwitz, the SS marched 60,000 prisoners west in freezing weather. Thousands died on the roads, shot, frozen, or worked to death. The Nazis called them evacuation marches. The prisoners called them exactly what they were: murder. Ravensbrück's turn came in April 1940. The SS began evacuating prisoners, 5,000 women forced to march northwest toward Mecklenburg. They marched in the snow with no coats, no shoes, no food. Guards shot anyone who fell behind. Hundreds died in the first 3 days. But not everyone marched. 3,500 women remained at Ravensbrück, too sick, too weak, or too valuable as hostages. The SS debated executing them. Himmler wanted them dead. Local commanders hesitated. The Allies were days away, and nobody wanted to be caught mid-massacre. On April 28th, the Swedish Red Cross arrived. Through secret negotiations with Himmler, who was desperately trying to save himself from war crimes prosecution, they secured permission to evacuate some prisoners. Over 2 days, they rescued 75 women, cramming them onto white buses and driving through German lines to safety in Sweden. But 3,400 remained, and on April 29th, the SS guards abandoned the camp. They burned records. They destroyed evidence. They fled west, leaving the prisoners locked inside with no food, no water, no guards. The women were free, but they were also trapped. April 30th, 1940, 4:47 a.m., the 49th Guards Rifle Division of the Soviet Red Army reached Ravensbrück. Lieutenant Eliseyev commanded the lead reconnaissance unit, 3 T-tanks and 30 infantrymen. Intelligence had told them to expect a work camp. What they found was something else. The gates were open, the guards were gone, and inside, thousands of women stood silently watching. Eliseyev later wrote in his diary, "They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stared at us like we were ghosts. Or maybe they were the ghosts. I couldn't tell anymore." One of his men, Sergeant Pavel Kovalenko, approached the nearest group of women. He spoke in Russian. "You're free. The Germans are gone. We're Soviet soldiers. You're safe now." Nobody responded. Then slowly, one woman stepped forward. She was maybe 30, maybe 60, impossible to tell. Starvation ages you. She looked at Kovalenko and said in broken Russian, "Prove it." Kovalenko didn't understand. Prove what? Prove you're not Nazis. The Soviets didn't understand at first. Why would the women doubt them? They were liberators, heroes, but the women of Ravensbrück had learned a hard lesson. Men in uniforms, any uniforms, were dangerous. So the Soviet soldiers did something extraordinary. They stopped, they sat down, they removed their helmets, and they waited. Eliseyev ordered his men to bring food not from camp supplies, but from their own rations: bread, sausage, tinned meat. They left it at the gates and backed away. The women watched, waited. Finally, one woman, Germaine Tillion, the French anthropologist, picked up a piece of bread. She smelled it, tasted it. Then she started crying. "It's real," she whispered. "It's real food." That's when the dam broke. Thousands of women collapsed, some crying, some laughing, some unable to process what was happening. They'd been prisoners for so long that freedom felt like a hallucination. But liberation wasn't simple, because inside Ravensbrück were 200 female SS guards, the Aufseherinnen, who'd stayed behind when the men fled. Some begged for mercy. Some tried to blend in with prisoners. Some stood defiantly, insisting they'd just followed orders. The Soviet soldiers wanted to shoot them immediately. Summary execution, justice delivered at the end of a rifle. But Eliseyev made a decision that saved lives. He asked the prisoners what they wanted. The women voted. Out of 3,500 survivors, 2,800 voted to turn the guards over to military tribunals. Not revenge, justice. Germaine Tillion later wrote, "We'd been treated like animals for years. We refused to become animals ourselves." The Soviets established a field hospital at Ravensbrück. Soviet doctors and nurses, many of them women, worked around the clock treating typhus, tuberculosis, starvation, and injuries from years of abuse. Over 300 women died in the first 2 weeks after liberation. Their bodies were too broken to survive freedom, but 3 children survived, and they had to figure out what came next. Some women wanted to go home, but where was home? Poland was now under Soviet control. France was rebuilding. Germany was divided and occupied. And for Jewish survivors, there was no home. Their families were dead. Their communities destroyed. The Soviet military created displaced persons camps, temporary housing for refugees waiting for repatriation. Ravensbrück survivors were scattered across dozens of camps in Soviet-controlled territory. Some waited months, some waited years, some never left. Others found different paths. Germaine Tillion returned to France and became one of the world's leading ethnologists. She testified at the Nuremberg trials, wrote books about Ravensbrück, and spent 50 years documenting Nazi crimes. She died in 2008 at age 100, still fighting for justice. Odette Sansom returned to Britain and became the first woman awarded the George Cross. She remarried, wrote her memoirs, and spent decades speaking about her experiences. When asked if she hated the Germans, she said, "I hate what they did, but I refuse to become what they were." The rabbits, the 74 Polish women subjected to medical experiments, many permanently disabled, returned to Poland. Some testified at Nuremberg. Others lived quietly, their injuries a permanent reminder of what they'd survived. In 1998, they were collectively awarded Poland's highest honor, the Cross of Grunwald. But not all stories ended well. Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier, a French resistance fighter who survived Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, testified at Nuremberg in 1940s. Her testimony was so powerful that the courtroom fell silent. But when she returned to France, she was treated with suspicion. People didn't believe her. The horrors she described seemed impossible. It took decades for France to acknowledge what she'd endured. Many survivors never spoke about Ravensbrück. The trauma was too deep, the memories too painful. They returned to ordinary lives, became teachers, nurses, mothers, grandmothers, and carried their secrets to the grave. In 1959, East Germany opened the Ravensbrück National Memorial. But it wasn't honest. The communist government emphasized political prisoners and downplayed the Jewish, Roma, and asocial victims. It took until 1993, after German reunification, for the memorial to tell the full truth. Today, Ravensbrück receives 300,000 visitors annually. The barracks are gone. The lake is peaceful again. But if you stand at the gates where Lieutenant Elisiev stood on April 30th, 1945, you can still feel it. The weight of 50,000 lives. The silence of women who refuse to be forgotten. Here's what I want you to remember about Ravensbrück. It wasn't the largest camp, it wasn't the deadliest, but it was the only major Nazi concentration camp designed specifically for women. And the women inside did something extraordinary. They survived with their humanity intact. They shared food when they had nothing. They hid children from extermination. They sabotaged German weapons. They documented Nazi crimes. They testified at trials. They refused to let the world forget. Between 1939 and 1940, over 130,000 women passed through Ravensbrück. Conservative estimates say 30,000 died, worked to death, executed, or murdered in subcamps. But 100,000 survived. That's not luck. That's resistance. The Nazis wanted to break these women, to erase them, to prove that inferior people, political dissidents, Jews, Roma, foreigners, deserved extermination. But every woman who survived Ravensbrück proved them wrong. Every testimony, every child saved, every act of sabotage, every refusal to become what the Nazis wanted them to be. That's what courage looks like. Not fearlessness, not heroism in battle, but the quiet, daily decision to remain human when everything around you is inhuman. So why does Ravensbrück matter 80 years later? Because the women who survived it taught us something essential, that the greatest act of resistance isn't violence. It's refusing to let your oppressor define who you are. Germaine Tillion said it best. The Nazis tried to reduce us to numbers. We insisted on remaining names. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that history's greatest lessons often come from its quietest voices, then share it. Because these women didn't survive Ravensbrück, so their stories could be forgotten. They survived so we would remember, so we would learn, so we would never let it happen again. Their names were Germaine, Odette, Marie, Helena, Rosa, and thousands more. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, fighters, survivors, and they refused to be erased. That's the legacy of Ravensbrück. Not death, survival, not hatred, humanity, not forgetting, remembering. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering.